In this video, I'm building floor-to-ceiling built-ins for some friends. And you could use some of these same processes to design and build your own.
Some friends reached out and wanted to add more usable space to the living room of their home. They had seen a few ideas they liked online, so I sketched up both classic and modern looks based on those in Fusion 360. Ultimately, they decided on a really modern, one-piece flat front design. To make the most of my material, I made a cut list from the design and typed it all into cutlistoptimizer.com. It built out the ideal layout for all 5 sheets with minimal
That
waste.
didn't work quite like I hoped, or look nearly as cool.
Since a lot of these cuts were going to be straight and parallel, it was a good excuse to try out this Craig Rip Cut guide. I loved their AccuCut XL, but this seemed like a foolproof way to make sure I was staying parallel without worrying about the AccuCut sliding around on the surface. Overall, I was impressed, and it took less than an hour to get all the rough cuts knocked out. This process did, however, illuminate my need for better dust collection on this circular saw. So, I ordered that attachment as soon as I was done. I ripped out the 4-inch wide strips that would become the cabinet spreaders and supports on the table saw. Then I used the miter saw to cut out all the sides and shelves. This is a pretty big project, and there were a lot of cuts for it. But that cut list optimizer really did a great job of helping me to plan ahead and reduce waste. The plan is to build these here in the shop, then transport them to the customer's home for installation. So I'll be assembling them in 8 pieces. 2 base cabinets, 2 shelves, and a 1-piece face frame and side covers to hide the seams. I used pocket holes for the outer shells and oriented them so that they'd be hidden once everything was assembled. The base cabinets needed to be open-backed to allow the customer access to all the existing plugs and media connections on those lower walls. And the shelves needed to be adjustable to accommodate their storage needs. So, I used this shelf pin jig to ensure everything was straight and consistent. With the base cabinets wrapped up, it was time to assemble the upper shelves. To do that, I first needed to cut the channel for the backer board, leaving enough room to allow the back to slide easily in between the shelves and the hidden lateral supports. Using a scrap piece of plywood as your setup block is a quick and easy way to be sure your first cuts are exactly right. I tested the new channel with a scrap piece of plywood to confirm a smooth fit. Then I added the same channel to the bottom of the bookshelves.
So you can see here, the way this lines up, this will be the very top. And so these will be hidden by the ceiling and then the crown molding. And then I'm gonna slide the back panel down in here and behind all the shelves, and it'll rest in that channel down there. And then I can just put some brad nails in at the shelves on the back, and it's gonna be nice and rigid and all one piece.
Here, I'm installing the lateral support braces to add some rigidity. For the shelves, I used a speed square and clamp to ensure everything stayed at 90 degrees and secured them using a finish nailer. Then, repeated the whole process to build out the second bookcase. I only had 1/4-inch piece of plywood in the shop, so I needed to run and get another in the morning. But I went ahead and cut the first backer board before calling it a day, then stupidly installed it with the bookcase laying flat, which made it much more difficult than it needed to be. I wrapped up the day by carrying the completed bookshelf over and setting it up next to its twin to get a good look. The next morning, I made a quick supply run, then came back and cut the second backer board. Installation was much easier this way, and the main structure was now complete. I made some measurements and a cut list for the face frames and started cutting everything out on the miter saw. The room these are going in isn't exactly symmetrical, as most rooms aren't. So the left and right widths are just slightly different, 3/4 inches to be exact. So I cut all the pieces from 2.5-inch wide primed pine, except for the top and bottom rungs where I used 5.5-inch primed pine. Then, I added pocket holes to the backs of each horizontal rung. After quickly swapping out the surface of my workbench, I assembled the first of the face frames, starting with the outside perimeter, then adding horizontal rungs so they match up with the shelves. And I marked each piece to make sure I didn't get anything mixed up while moving things around. I completed the assembly by adding the cabinet divider, then assembled the second face frame and stood them up for a test fitting. I could already tell these were going to look great. Now, let's build some doors. I'm using the shaper for this, along with a 1/4-inch tongue and groove set, but you can do the same thing with a table saw or a router table. I cut the panel for each door on the table saw, then wrapped up the day by gluing and clamping everything together so they could dry overnight. The next morning was everybody's favorite sanding day. With the sanding wrapped up, the last step before priming and painting is to get the adjustable shelves ready.
I have never done edge banding before. It seems pretty straightforward. I bought the tools for a few bucks each. This stuff was not very expensive on Amazon. And I feel like it's gonna be pretty straightforward, but disclaimer, I don't know what I'm doing.
As expected, this wasn't rocket surgery. I used an iron to attach the pre-glued edge banding, cut off the ends, then I used this couple dollar tool from Amazon to trim it all down flush. It looked great on the first try. I knocked off the edges and smoothed everything out with the sander, and it was time to start painting. I know I said in a previous video that I was going to be all HVLP going forward, but I started with the HVLP gun on this project, and likely due to my lack of experience with the gun and its settings, it was taking a really long time and looked really, really bad. So I called an audible and went back to the trusty yet laborious brushes and rollers.
I hate painting.
I remembered the next morning that I'd forgotten to cut the side covers. So I ran those over the table saw and slapped a quick coat of primer on those too. The customer chose a color called Sherwood Forest for this project. And over the course of the next several days, I rolled on 2 full coats of paint, around 3/4 of the gallon, with the intention of doing one final coat once everything was installed on location. On delivery day, things didn't get off to a great start. It was cold and windy that morning, and before I even got to the end of my street, the wind snapped one of the side panels in half. But I made it there, unloaded, and got straight to work. My hope was to finish all the carpentry in the first day, then come back and paint the second day. I'm removing the baseboard here and attempting to leave just enough room for the side and front panels to slide in later. What you see me doing with this putty knife is very important. If you don't cut out the caulk before you start ripping up baseboards, you will oftentimes peel big chunks of the drywall and paint off with it. So make sure it's scored really well before you pry those out. The floor here was actually really level, or at least the same amount of crooked as my shelf, so I didn't have to do any shims and was able to just attach it straight to the wall. The customer wanted to maximize the width of the upper shelf space and for the mantle to butt right into the side, so that meant I had to carve a little off of each end. You have to be really careful with the Sawzall around drywall. One slip and that thing will stab the drywall 100 times or just rip right through. So I cut it as close as I could, then used the reciprocating saw to finish it out. I didn't think this part through as thoroughly as I should have. I'd used the original measurements and removed a ½ inch so that this should have slid in really easily. But those original measurements were at the wall, and apparently the ceiling sagged a bit with age because it was exactly 8 feet. Additionally, because of the depth of the shelves and the mantle sticking out, I could not wedge it into that corner, so I was in a bit of a pickle. Luckily, on this side, there was already a visible joint in the crown molding just a few inches further forward, so I was able to just pull out that extra piece and slide it into place. I didn't want to remove any more crown molding than I had to on this side, especially since there were no visible seams. So I decided to approach it a little differently. I lifted the bookcase into place from the bottom so it would fit cleanly around the obstacles, then slid the cabinet shell underneath it. This strategy worked way better. I secured the face frames using a pin nailer, then attached the doors. I went ahead with the doors before the last coat of paint because I wanted to be sure everything was nice and even all around. I did have to do some sanding and make a few adjustments to the hinges and clasps to get everything straight. But once I finished those adjustments, I cleaned up and called it a day. The next morning, I cut all the trim and quarter round and installed it with the pin nailer, along with the replacement for the panel I broke the day before. Then, I jumped right into caulking and painting. I ended up putting 2 additional coats on before the end of the day, but I think it turned out great, and the customer loved seeing their design come to life. They're already brainstorming how to modernize the fireplace next. I was thinking dry stack stone and maybe rough sawn mantle. If you have any ideas, drop them in the comments. This project was so much fun and made a huge difference in the usable space in their living room by providing a ton of extra storage. It was also a great experience for me to learn a lot about these processes while also helping out some friends. Check out the description for links to tools and materials used in this video, along with links to my other social media accounts. If you found any part of this helpful or entertaining, also consider joining us over on Patreon as we discuss projects and build out the community. Thanks so much for watching.